Welcome back to Washington Watch. I'm Tony Perkins, your host. All right, as promised, we've got a poll question for you today. And first, text the word radio to 53445, and you'll get a link back. But here's the question. Do you believe that across the country the voting process was legal and the votes were accurately counted in this year's election? Or do you believe that there were significant problems with the way the election was conducted or votes were counted? Now, there's a reason for that wording and the length of that question. Text the word radio to 53445. Later in the program, we're going to be joined by George Barna, who actually polled what's called SageCon's spiritually active, governance-engaged conservatives across the country. That very question. I want to see where our listeners stack up, so help us out. Text the word radio to 53445. We're going to have the results later in the program. All right, yesterday, Stephanie Borowitz, state representative from Pennsylvania, joined us to discuss the resolution that they attempted to pass, calling on Congress to declare that the electoral vote in Pennsylvania, the results were in dispute. Part of that goes back to what took place last Wednesday at Gettysburg, a special hearing to look into election irregularities. And here is a short clip from last week's hearing. This is retired Colonel Phil Waldron, a former combat officer with a background in Army information and electronic warfare. Here's a clip.
Our experts and other academics believe that up to 1.2 million Pennsylvania votes could have been altered or fraudulent. This is what we discovered in the last 22 days. Really, only a detailed forensic analysis of the actual machines and software will truly show how many Pennsylvania citizens have had their civil rights violated.
Joining me now to talk more about this, Paul Kengor, professor of political science at Grove City College. Professor, welcome to Washington Watch.
Yeah, thanks, Tony. Good to be with you.
Now, there's some amazing stuff that came here, and you wrote an article about it. By the way, there's a link at tonyperkins.com. You kind of covered last week's hearing. But one of the things that stood out to me, there were two things. The first one was this. There were a request of, if I'm reading this right, of 1.8 million mail-in ballots were sent out by the Commonwealth, yet 2.5 million mail-in ballots were counted. How do you do that?
Yeah, in fact, and Rudy Giuliani immediately sort of cross-examined Phil Waldron, who's the retired Army colonel, on that question. So they came up with 766,000 missing ballots in their view. Now, since then, Tony, the Pennsylvania Office of Secretary of State has updated that information, and they now say that there are 3.1 million ballots that were sent out. And so I guess Waldron would say that information has been changed, presumably corrected, assuming that it's correct. But even then, and we're addressing this in my Spectator article right now because there's now more information than we had when Waldron said that. But even if that's correct, that the 3.1 million were sent out, about 2.6 million were supposedly returned. In other words, filled out and returned. And, Tony, that's like a 90% return rate on mail-in ballots. I mean, that's extraordinarily high. I mean, we would be surprised if that's correct. And there's even a piece out now by Daniel Horowitz. It's up at the Blaze on how even if it was indeed 3.1 million ballots, and there were 2.6 million returned, what it would still have taken for Joe Biden to have overtaken Donald Trump's 700,000 vote lead in Pennsylvania on November 3rd seems statistically impossible. And so even the mail-in ballots, I mean, that remains, I think, the shadiest question of all. And frankly, this is the problem with mail-in balloting. It's why 2/3 of the countries in the European Union ban it, and it's why so many states in America ban it, because the opportunities for fraud are just enormous.
Well, let me ask you this, Professor. If, let's give them the benefit of the doubt that this was a mistake and so they corrected it.
Right.
But in something so significant as elections and determining the leader of the free world, if we're that sloppy, where we make those kinds of mistakes, would that not draw more scrutiny to the process?
Yeah, it should. And I could tell you, as somebody who voted in Pennsylvania, I mean, I went into my little local small town voting center, and even though the little old lady from the League of Women Voters who knew who I was, she asked me for my ID. I had to sign. I had to sign there, and my son, who has the same first name that I do, his name was right above mine. He had to show his ID. He had to put a signature there. And you can't guarantee that with mail-in ballots. And what's even worse is that once these mail-in ballots come in, the envelopes, they discard the envelopes. So you can't go back and double-check to see exactly where they all came from. And also, Tony, there's an enormous number of we're not sure. In fact, probably 2 or 3 days after the election, the number estimated was at least 450,000. I'm sure it's way higher than that now. There's an enormous number of mail-in ballots that had only Joe Biden's name circled. Yeah. That, in other words, nobody else was voted for at all. Now I'll concede this. It's possible that so many of those people came out because they hated Donald Trump and they just wanted to vote for Biden and nothing else. That's possible. I don't know how common that is to have only the president checked off and nobody else. But I find that too curious, especially given, again, the opportunities for fraud, the lack of verification in the mail-in balloting process.
Yeah, I mean, those things do happen, but as I've talked to other statisticians, there are norms in which that happens. Just as you were talking about the percentage of mail-in ballots that returned, history will give us kind of the parameters and shows us if there are outliers. This election, too many outliers. Yeah. And very on the way out, you made the other point. A lot of information here, but something was missing, in particular the media, ignoring all of this.
That's right. Yeah, that's been the biggest scandal in all of it. It really has.
All right, Professor, thanks so much for joining us. Very interesting article. I'll encourage people to take a look at it.
Thanks, Tony.
All right, Paul Kengor, Professor of Political Science at Grove City. All right, coming up next, some of America's largest corporations, these titans of social justice, actually working behind the scenes to water down a bill that would protect the Uyghur Muslims. Commissioner Nuri Turkel joins me next. Don't go away.